So I've had quite an interesting journey. One of the main pivot points of my life is the unemployment benefit. It was a fantastic decision. I actually got a lot of opportunity from that. I managed to luck out with getting a place on a Be Your Own Boss course. And that was the starting point of everything that came for the next 15 or 16 years after that. Where I'm at currently is I'm working as one of the co-founders of realtor.co.nz, and I'm currently running calculate.co.nz. And during the day, I work in analytics for a software company. When I picture my future, I hope that I can look back and feel that my life was more than just a passing moment. I want to have made a meaningful difference, a small ripple in a vast ocean, perhaps, but one that sparked positive change. My wish is that my legacy will reflect resilience, compassion, and purpose so that my grandchildren and all who came before me can feel proud of the path that I have chosen. And that is a life filled with meaning.
Hey, and welcome to another episode of Ways to Wealth. Today we have James Graham with us. James, please give us the TLDR on who you are and how you got to be where you are.
So I've had quite an interesting journey, but where I'm at currently is I'm working as one of the co-founders of a neat web project, which is realtor.co.nz. I've previously spent time and I'm currently running calculate.co.nz. And during the day, I work in analytics for a software company. So yeah, it's been quite a varied journey, but quite a lot of work in the web project management space and development space.
Nice. But you have a clear interest in finance and building your asset base as well. You were telling me about a lot of the stuff that you're working on, and I definitely think we should talk about domains today, perhaps. But you're keen to continue to build those blocks of equity, it seems.
Sure. So yes, I've spent quite a lot of time over the last, say, 15 to 20 years with quite a clear view. I've always been rather future focused and ultimately have made quite a number of decisions essentially to either open pathways or progress along pathways to move towards my ultimate goals. And a lot of that has predominantly been more so in the web space, whether that be digital assets, domains, buying and selling of websites, creating websites and content that will then essentially utilize online advertising or affiliate marketing. That's ultimately been the type of strategy that I've put forth back then. And naturally, given that time has passed and things have progressed in a positive way, it's all moved in a direction that I'm happy with. That those things have either grown in terms of size, in terms of users or traffic, or ultimately in terms of community, in terms of local involvement, respective media appearances, or in the case of domains, for example, it would be that they've ultimately grown in value across time, as does any finite resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. And were you always entrepreneurial from a young age? Like, this is like, you seem to have kept a really strong income throughout your career. However, you've been doing a lot of projects. So was there a catalyst in your life that kind of led to that, or were you just always kind of that way inclined?
Yeah, great question. I think that from the early days of the internet, so very late 90s, very early 2000s, I've always had an interest in websites and essentially building things. I suppose I have quite an acquisitive mind, and I like to see that what can be achieved in various areas. And with the websites, it was quite clear early on that I could create content that people would generally have an interest in. But one of the key things that I've learned that's been my advantage in this area is I come from an analyst background. So many, if not all, of the decisions that I make are ultimately data driven. So when I started to essentially take this on board to a higher degree, which was probably about the 2008, 2009 time period, I utilized my skill set in data to actually flip it around, and instead of myself creating things that people would ultimately potentially come to, I looked at what actually were people wanting and needing on the internet via tools like Google Keyword
Right.
tool, and created content based on that, ultimately to then monetize that. Then I would run a series of testing on that based on A/B testing, variant testing to see what did and didn't work. Naturally, because it's like it's dipping your toe into a pool, you need to know A, what's the temperature, and B, how deep it is. Realistically, you should probably test how deep it is first. But by doing that, what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to scale up 1, 2, 3 sites to a portfolio of over 150 that were working quite specifically in calculator or near calculator niches in New Zealand and across the world.
Yeah, that's quite neat. And I guess you've just been tinkering away, and you've used contractors where you needed extra resource and just kind of tinkered away, mostly just on your own.
At the very start, I was doing almost everything myself, and there was one year, I think it was possibly 2010, 2011, in which I set myself a goal that I'd create 50 websites in a year, and in the period I ended up doing about 100. But what I realized was actually there are certainly better people than myself at creating websites. They're much more efficient. The code is cleaner, and the end result is more polished. And what I could do is utilize naturally monetary resources that I had to hire them as contractors to achieve a net greater result than if I was to use my time to do that. So it's the classic, if I can utilize somebody's skill set that's greater than mine, and the net cost of that is actually less than less than 1 hour's worth of time monetarily from my side, then that's quite scalable. So I moved probably in that time period to using contractors and freelancers to complete the bulk of the work, using quite specific and quite well-defined briefs that I'd put together, utilizing my skills in, say, project management, and naturally because I'd already done 50, 60, 100 of these before, so it was quite simple. Then I moved into more singular sites that had more breadth, which then became more of a project management role and testing role. So it was a good use of capital at the time to be able to expand out beyond my skill set and beyond my time set as well, because ultimately I was looking to not spend as much time on the computer.
Nice. That's a goal. Current goal. Tell me about your time in South Korea.
South Korea was a really interesting time for me. So I went back to the UK in 2007 looking to progress my academic studies. I learned quite quickly when I got there that I was actually going to be classified as a international student because I had been out of the UK for too long. That wasn't great. That was one of life's great surprises. And at the time, I looked for work, and it was very, very, very difficult where I'm from and where I was staying, which is the northeast of England, for any I suppose work that aligned with my skill set. And at the time, there was quite a lot of opportunity overseas to teach English, and I applied for a few jobs. One was in Japan, one was in Korea, one was in, I think, South Sudan, and I got offers on all of them. And I chose Korea because at the time they actually were going to throw in the apartment, which was quite meaningful. I went there. It was very, very different to what I'd experienced in New Zealand and even in the UK. I found that there's quite a different set of focuses on what predominantly children who I was working with as a teacher were either meant to do or should be doing at various ages. So I did my time as a teacher. I learned a lot about, I suppose, the younger generation, fantastic, fantastic kids. Really, really great. A lot of them very hungry to learn. And ultimately, you try and teach as best you can, but I think it really boils down to the fact that you're speaking English and they're looking to learn English. So no matter what you're doing, they're still learning. For me personally, it was probably my second trip away from home. Naturally, going back to the UK, I'd left New Zealand, but this was the one in which I ultimately went, and I was by myself. I met a lot of different people from around the world, a lot of Canadians, Brits, and Australians. I made some fantastic friends that I really do still keep in contact with. So fantastic people. And I think what it taught me was, well, when I wasn't playing games, which was a lot of the time, it was kind of one of those things where I was caught up in a world in which I was very interested in doing something, which was playing StarCraft, which a lot of other people were very interested in doing at the same time. So we spent a lot of time doing that. When I finished work, I'd go straight to the gaming cafe and play games there until the early hours. That's the beauty of a 2 p.m. till 10 p.m. private school.
Right.
You can spend a little bit more time at night, and it was also great that all of the other teachers had the exact same work hours. So the social life was really fantastic. Got to see a wee bit of the country, but mostly we just focused on doing the work and trying to make it as fun as possible, because at the end of the day, we're all away from our
Right.
primary friends and family. But it was quite interesting as well, because you saw a lot of different types of people and the way that they manage not only themselves, but the way that they manage their finances. In Korea at the time, the salary for the type of work we were doing was on par with a middle-aged business person, so actually really quite strong. Income tax, I think, at the time was less than 2%, so it was pretty much
Wow.
what you earned is what you got. It was given to you each month in a giant bag. I think at the time it was about 2.1 million won, which I think the largest bill was 10,000. So it was literally a bag of money, and it was all cash. So what that meant was you did actually see quite a big variety of ways in which people manage the money. For myself, I've always been really conservative in terms of my spending, and I managed to save probably about 80% of the money that I earned over there. So I came back to New Zealand with a good amount of money to essentially tide me over. When I got back to New Zealand, 2008, right in the middle of the GFC, global financial crisis, which wasn't the best time to be looking for your first, say, corporate job in New Zealand, especially coming off quite a niche university degree, which was human geography and biological anthropology or social anthropology, which kind of narrowed the possible options I had. It was almost entirely council type work or those types of things, and they weren't necessarily hiring, which meant that that actually was one of the main kickers or pivot points of my life, because as I was unable to essentially get work, I was living off the money that I'd saved and brought back. And that got to a point in which I legitimately had to say to myself, well, this money's going to run out. You don't really have many other options. And for me, it's one point in which I basically had to say, well, the only real option I have for myself at this point in time is to look into the unemployment benefit, which it's a really interesting thing to be in that position. And what I found was at that time for myself, it was a fantastic decision, naturally, because in a way it was somewhat survival required. But I actually got a lot of opportunity from that. essentially because the types of case manager that I work with, they said, well, actually, what do you want to do? And I would say, well, this doesn't feel like me. And I appreciate that, the situation is the situation, but do you have any opportunities for doing, for the learning or teaching or those types of things? And for the most part, it was not really, but eventually I managed to lock out with getting a place on a Be Your Own Boss course,
right,
through Trade and Enterprise New Zealand. And that was technically the starting point of everything that came for the next 15 or 16 years after that.
right. Nice. It's quite a journey, right? So then from that point on, was there a catalyst or a moment where you're like, man, were you quite focused on not being in that situation again? Like, what was the thought process that were kind of going through your head at the time? Or were you just like, oh, it's inevitable, it'll come right?
It's definitely more the former. I think in life, I don't want to be a passenger in my own life. And I don't necessarily believe in the, everything will come right. I really think that you have to move and try and influence as best you can in a positive way, the types of outcomes that you want. It's the type of scenario where if somebody tells you what they actually want, you're more likely to get it rather than them not mentioning that because there are a plethora of other options. So I went out of my way to basically take advantage of the opportunity. It was a fantastic opportunity. It was a 3-month course, 4-month course. I learned a lot there, put forth a business case, got a grant from it, which allowed me to transition into doing website development actually as a job. Very quickly learned that I really did not like that at all, working with clients. But what I actually realized also was I still like doing this type of work, but I really need to work out a way of making this succeed for myself. And I put it back on myself. I said, well, okay, what I can do is I can either put this down and say, okay, well, the business case, I tried it out and it didn't work. Or I can pivot and say, well, they will still be very happy if I take this and I'm still in business in, 1, 2, 10, 15 years, of course. So what I can do is I can say, well, what actually makes me the happiest? I'm still doing the type of work that I enjoy. I still think it's positive for society. It's all value add. Everything that I've ever created, specifically if you look back more so on the calculator side or the health content, has always been free. And the reason I went about it that way is, well, actually, in my life, there's been a lot of times in which I've basically thought I could probably do with some help here, whether it's maybe I'll need a little bit of help here or, okay, I've landed back home in the middle of the GFC. Nobody's hiring. Prospects aren't great. And I genuinely don't know when this type of economic climate is going to end. So I ask for help that way. With the type of work that I've done is, yes, it's on a much smaller scale. Maybe it helps somebody out for 5 seconds, but you multiply that 5 seconds out by a large number of people, and I think that that's like a really positive driver. So I kept it upon myself to keep at it, always with the view of creating and expanding out, mainly in terms of user counts. And also just then, once I'd got a probably a critical level to the amount or count of websites that I could actually handle, I transitioned into moving into different types of projects, more so higher quality or niches that actually then would benefit me personally. I started doing a lot of things around assisting people with job interviews and those soft skill type contents. So I actually create a lot of content that's really also useful for myself because it's it's 2 birds, 1 stone.
Totally, absolutely, yeah. It seems like you're very systems orientated. So you kind of built that over time. What really influenced that? Was it the training course, or was it prior to that?
I think I've always been like that. I think that I'm quite particular in the way that I do things.
Mm,
If you think about it, technically everything has an order of operations in the way that's an optimal way of progressing with a task. I find that given that ultimately for myself I am quite time poor
yeah.
uh, during the day, I need to really go out there and prioritize the things that are most important to be done to ensure that they get knocked off, because it's the classic to-do list. The to-do list never really goes down. It just changes the type of
Hmm.
content that's on there. So at least if you're hitting the things that are at the top, you're probably in about an 80% ballpark of the types of things you should be doing and the times that you should be doing them, to ensure that as you progress in terms of time, you're not tripping up on a I didn't do this and that's cost me. So it's trying to move through time with as few roadblocks as possible, but by preempting the types of roadblocks you're going to encounter and essentially knocking those off first. So it's one of the disciplines that I suppose I've learned managing, a corporate career as well as a business, as well as, attempting obviously to have a social life and recently, being a fully present parent, which is an incredibly valuable time set for
Totally.
myself, but more so for my son, because every hour that I get to spend with him is literally gold.
Mm, yeah, that's awesome. So that's become a focus for you in terms of your wealth then, since he's come around.
I think everything that I do now aligns with what I'd originally planned, which is to set up myself and my family for an easier second half
Right.
of my life. And naturally, given the timings, that implies that if it's easier for myself and my family, it's easier for everyone in my family. And my
Mm,
son is a main driver for that now. A lot of the things that we look, myself and my partner is a fantastic person, mother, um, amazing to the point in which there's a lot of neural load that I generally don't have in that space, because I know that she's so exceptional at it. It gives me a lot of peace to be able to focus on tasks that I need to, and then rejoin in a really positive, mood. But a lot of the things that we're doing now is essentially, looking at, well, when my son hits 18, what do I think the world is going to look
yeah,
like?
exactly.
And then what do I need to do to make sure that we are succeeding as best we can at that point in the world? I have an idea of what I think it's going to look like, but it's one of those ones that even if I'm out by 10, 20, 30%, that's still good. I like to use the analogy, like, as long as when you're pivoting, you generally have a pretty good idea of where you're going.
Mm,
You've got that North Star that by the time you get there, even if you're a few degrees off north, you're still at north. You're not at south, you're not at southwest. You're in that right space at the
totally.
right time. And, who knows how many times we're going to have to pivot over the next, decade, 2 decades. But as long as we're heading in that right direction, accumulating time predominantly, that is the most important resource, especially with children and family. But I think
Totally.
that due to the future focus and conservative nature of the way that I'm allocating funds and resources at this point in time, we should be well set. And I think that, looking back, when we do actually get to that point, I think it'll actually really resonate with the goals that I've set myself both 10 years ago
Mm,
and now, because they're essentially still the same. And I'd like to think that also still be the same, or there or thereabouts when we get to that point in time.
totally. Yeah, I mean, do you think those 10, so do you think that stayed quite static, like that North Star? Like it doesn't have a specific number perhaps, but it has a specific coordinates that are within a certain range in terms of how you want life to look like? Because I do this thing called 12, 12, 12, but I also have an extra 12, which is 12 years. But usually I'm thinking in 12 months, 12 weeks, and 12 days. And I usually do that at the start of every year. to basically give myself a boost. But my 12-year goals are pretty much, obviously they're not touched for the next 12 years. Well, less than that now, about 6 years or maybe 5 years left. Do you think those larger goals change, or do you think they're not even though they might be defined in one artifact, they're not really? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, as I get older, I think that a lot of people probably think in maybe an absolute dollar value. Ultimately, if they're looking at that, that retirement number, that retirement figure, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, that's a very relevant measure. I guess for me, I've kind of looked at it a little bit differently because it's all about trajectories. Firstly, is if we stay on the current trajectory or improve the current trajectory, then I know that by the time I get to plus 10 years from now, plus 20, plus 25, we're going to be in a good space. Why do I know that? Because I'm in a good space now, and a net movement that is the same or better than this will imply that we're in a positive space for myself and for my family.
Nice.
And I think that if I am to look back, I actually wrote a piece for a talk that I did, and I'll tell you a little snippet of it. It's quite succinct, but I literally have this printed on a different wall. But what I did was I started with the end of the story first in the presentation. And I said, when I picture my future, I hope that as an older person surrounded by family, I can look back and feel that my life was more than just a passing moment. I want to have made a meaningful difference, a small ripple in a vast ocean, perhaps, but one that sparked positive change. My wish is that my legacy will reflect resilience, compassion, and purpose so that my grandchildren and all who came before me can feel proud of the path that I have chosen. I know that I'll have lost battles along the way, but if I stay true to what's right, then I'll have won the war on the journey that matters the most. And that is a life filled with meaning, whatever that means when I get there. But I kind of look at personal wealth in multifold. Naturally, there's the associated dollars and cents, bank accounts, and values of assets. They're extremely important, specifically as you transition into later life when you look at retirement. But for me, I think that actually, as I've grown up with a relatively lean environment, I've never been the type of person that's really interested in hoarding various things to a degree or having overtly flashy things. It's mainly been consolidation around the fundamentals, ensuring that everyone has what they need. Like my son will never and has never wanted for anything. It's there, to the point in which, it brings me great joy to be able to provide these things. And on the other side, it's not like I'm saying like I'm going without. That's certainly not the case. But I'm more looking at it as everything that I'm doing to the side, it works as long as that trend line is going in the direction that I'm intending, and you keep an eye on that, then great. Add in a few irons to the fire with various other business interests and opportunities that come along. But nobody's really going to judge me personally with how much money I've gained when I hit that 80-year-old, or what my bank account is. If I pass when I'm 80, my family's probably not going to care if I have maybe even 0 cents in there. The only thing that'll matter to them at that point is if they could say that I was a good man, I was a good person, I was a good partner, I was a good father. So those two key pillars are essentially what drives me. Naturally, I think that with the skill set and the level of discipline that I've had, the dollars and cents are and will look after themselves. We've spent some time talking previously, and I think we're quite aligned in the type of ways that we work.
Totally, yeah. Well, I mean, there's definitely an approach which I really appreciate with how you're kind of designing things. And yeah, I guess here we're talking a bit more about the freedom to exist. One, doing the things you want to do, and two, doing them in an environment that makes you fulfilled. which goes well beyond the work you're doing, even though I think with, when depending on how you're wired, and especially when you're wired in a way where you want to build things, then that can be quite an obsessive path even. And it's always about balancing that.
Yes, I think the obsessive path, it's, once you get creating one thing, it tends to be like balloons popping up in your mind. You think, well, what happens if we were to do this thing? Or actually, maybe this is a great idea. Struggle is reining in those types of things. It's potentially but the type of thinking is, potentially it's a bit ADHD in terms of reining in and focusing on the key things.
Mm-hmm.
I think with my skill set and my ability to succeed is, I, even in my day job, I think I convey myself as a generalist. Yes, I'm an expert in my field, but I think that because of the way I think about probably most things in terms of the fundamentals, the building blocks of what makes them, it's not hard to actually get to that point in which you can sit at that 8 or 9 out of 10 level of expertise. If you put that into the startup world or the business world, then you kind of have to rein that in and say, okay, well, what are we doing in this task here? What is the goal of this? What do we need to do to achieve it? And making sure that's laser focused with the various tasks, and quite prescriptive. But yes, it's one of the beauties of obviously doing work for a startup or a smaller team, or even for yourself to some degree, because naturally you don't have somebody managing or micromanaging. And if something does come up that is a point of joy, or even the other way around, you can actually make some conscious decisions to move forward with your day being actually overall pretty positive. And that's great because you get to talk to a lot of people that are in a similar boat. They have their own story. You learn from them. Maybe they learn from you. And it's really good as well, just because, like, personally, I really enjoy seeing people succeed. And one of the biggest drivers why I've almost every website except for Realtor that I've ever done has been essentially free to use for the end user.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because it's a real joy of seeing people actually learn how to do something that at one point they may have thought complex.
Yeah.
They've gone through a process, they've learned. Maybe they don't need to use the website anymore, which is, unfortunate for me, but it's one of those things where you're like, well, I helped them for a time. Maybe they clicked some sort of ad on the free to use website. Maybe they didn't. But it's great to see people, improve, and talking with peers in the tech space, the startup space is really great as well, because everyone's got their own story, everyone's got their own background, and not two of them are even remotely the same. I think, like, listening to your story was super interesting, because your background in itself is quite different to the traditional background of somebody that would be sitting in a conversation like this, but also as is mine.
Yeah, I like to think a lot about, we're not starting at the same starting point. Success is so relative that you can't say, oh, well, it's a number. It's not a number, because you see, I can start here and you're over here in your starting lane, and that's great. We can both have relatively amazing successes, but they're not like for like, because you're dealt a hand that you're dealt, and then you have to slowly try and improve on that hand. And perhaps sometimes we take for granted where we start. And actually, I think adversity and challenge is quite helpful for shaping someone. And I think also moving geographic location is huge for the development, as is kids. There are basically a bunch of hacks where your brain goes into overdrive and basically evolves you, of which having a business, raising capital, having kids, moving country, moving house, getting married, all of these things force you into a state and kind of break the status quo.
Definitely. I mean, if you can form some form of successful negotiation with a 2-year-old, there's absolutely no one on the planet that you can't really enter into a dialogue with. I've had, in the last year alone, I've talked to some really quite successful people in New Zealand, and they've put forth things, and maybe they've been trying to lean on their I suppose their reputation and their weight a little bit, and it's generally been well, actually the counterpoint of that is, realistically, I'm probably one of, if not the only person in New Zealand that can do that for you. So what we can do to move forward is this and this. And if they say, okay, well, I'm leaving this conversation, there's no negative outcome for me, because ultimately I made that choice to enter into it that way. And it's amazing how much, in terms of negotiation, or even sometimes, just how to deal with completely irrational situations, that you learn to deal with from a child, because not only do you have to ensure that the decision you make is correct, but your tone, the way that you're moving, your body language, because it's like having somebody that's essentially recording everything that you do say, in their mind, and then they'll remember that, and then they'll test you again the next time, with a different response, to see if you can deal with it. And all of those have been probably the one of, if not the biggest, level up for me, as being, actually being a parent, because it makes you step outside of yourself and think, okay, well, this is how I actually feel about this scenario. And chances are it's probably going to be this isn't great, and I generally don't understand what's happening. But then you step into your other thing, which is, but I can't let them know that. And they need to know that I'm not reacting, so they don't vibe off that. And they need to know that my response is going to be consistent every time, so they learn the various boundaries. But then you also need to step into the other one, which is, regardless of what has happened, you need to exit that conversation with them knowing that everything's okay, you love them, and you're there for them, like, unconditionally. Now, corporates don't work that way, naturally. Sometimes there's some things that go on that you generally think, really? Okay. But you still need to take quite a lot of those lessons through there to ensure that you've got a really good dynamic with your peers. But then if you move into the startup space, you also have to do the same, because at the end of the day, the brand is you. You are the brand. Naturally, there are other members, and the same applies for them as well. But at the end of the day, you look at the news, and companies are judged by the key members. There's some really obvious examples going on right now in the world that I'm not going to touch on, but I guess the key point is, being a parent can teach you a lot, and that really does flow through almost every other facet of your life, in a positive way from the learning standpoint. Maybe not so much in the frustration and the tiredness and the general aging, 5 years per year kind of thing, whilst you're also trying to balance,
yeah,
other
totally. I mean,
commitments.
I think there's a few things right there. Is like, one is the world is not as stable as we sometimes like to think. We like to think that everything is really kind of solid and nothing can change it. Whereas I think that we all find out at various points in life that it is actually, on a day-to-day basis, relatively fragile. And then two would be, don't underestimate how your prior scenarios are going to prepare you for future scenarios. So, no, yes, I was going to say, so, you did talk about 10 to 15 years to 25 years. Those are quite far in the future. What about 5 years? Where will Realtor be in 5 years? What other things will you have established, and what will that base look like in the next 5 years?
So we do have a roadmap that is essentially 1 month out to 10 years. For Realtor, essentially, the royal we, we're using the same type of approach to what I did, to calculate, which is create a foundational base, which is extremely high quality information that's logically structured, that allows the layperson, whether they're buying, selling, or building, to jump into their respective stage in the pipeline and then basically get assistance along the way. People will either need help or not. If they get to the end and think, actually, I didn't learn anything from this, amazing. The key point here is if you get along those one of those things and something sticks out and you think, I generally don't know what this is. Or alternatively, I knew what this is, but I didn't realize its relative importance. And a classic example that I give is if you're buying a property and you have essentially an offer accepted, and you've got on the sale and purchase agreement standard terms. So personally, I always like to think from the perspective of protecting the buyer. So I always like to say, if the default is 10 days on there for key conditions, finance, building report, change it to 15 because those extra days may come in handy. The classic thing is if you've put 10 days on there and you don't realize that actually in your respective council or region, many of the councils have SLAs of 10 working days for LEMs. So if you don't order that LEM on day 0 or day 1, actually there's a chance that you may not even get that in your conditional period, and you may have to make a decision. And that decision will be, will I go ahead with this purchase or not? And that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of your entire life, because the LEM could, in this example, surface something that would be an absolute hard deal breaker that your lawyer would have said 100% exit this. But because of the timings, something as simple as that is you're going to order it anyway. Might as well do it on day 0 if you can, day 1 if you can't. Moving towards that level of thinking, it goes back to, again, everything has an order of operations. Putting forth that rigor and allowing people to say, hey, actually, well, if you can call the council as quickly as possible, it's only in your favor. It's a task you have to do. It's going to take the same amount of literal time and money on day 0 as day 9, but it really might change the outcome of this purchase. So, yeah, with that in mind, we've got a really great base set of data. We have helped quite a lot of people. Somewhat so on the finance side, we've got a really great set of partner advisors. So that's what I would consider phase 1. Phase 2, we will look to expand into quite obvious areas. I'm not going to mention them now because they are technically still in development or still in planning. But what essentially it looks like in 5 years is, well, I'd like to think that you would basically, if anybody asked a question around property, whether they're a first home buyer or they're somebody that's maybe transacted before and they're looking to get either updated information, favorable rates, or to list or to check properties, or alternatively work out potentially the value of the property, they'll think, well, there's one site that I know that not only is actively there trying to help people, it's not a ruse of any kind. It's literally there. It does what it says on the tin. There's nothing hidden. There's no hidden agenda. It's the same way that they could also look at, say, Calculate, and Calculate's probably one of the more obvious. It literally only does what it says on the tin, and that's it. You use it, it either works for you, and you find your answers, amazing. You don't have to come back. I'd like us to have essentially the sentiment where it's the first name on people's lips, or the first recommendation, because we've done everything right. We've entered into the type of business that's actually got people and assisting people as the primary driver, because it's a space in which actually it's really quite difficult and stressful and expensive. We're trying to make it so that actually it's a little bit easier and a little bit less stressful, and ultimately potentially a little bit less expensive, because maybe the end user has made fewer mistakes in terms of wrong decisions. So after about 5 years, we will have a fully fledged portal that in theory should do everything that anybody that's transacting property in New Zealand will be able to use for their full end-to-end journey, to the point in which they will also come back the next time they buy, sell, build, which would be, say in 3 years' time, and they would also, recommend it. So we'll get this, self-perpetuating growth trajectory, in which actually, because it's one of those services and ultimately products that really does right by the people in terms of its foundational setup, its pricing strategy, and overall what it actually does to facilitate transactions in the property space. That's where we're going to be. I think we will be able to achieve it, mainly because it's a completely different strategy and thought set to what I see in the market at the moment. I think that this space is ripe for disruption, but I don't mean disruption from a, hey, we'll go in, we'll flip things around, and actually this is the new world in terms of how much things cost. It's more like a, well, actually, what is important to the people? What do they actually need? Where are parts in which you can fill some gaps? And then just actually running the business in a reasonable way, so that everything is, when people look at how much things inevitably will cost or the services that are available, they think that's actually really reasonable. There's no reason I would not use this website in the future. And that's always been about realizing that with regards to, say, pricing strategy, it's always better to ensure that the customer has almost zero negative sentiment towards your business, because they will come back. And if you look at it from, say, a lifetime revenue perspective, which is a multi-year, potentially multi-decade based measure, then if you treat your people like that from the very start, they see you doing the same thing, you live what you say, and you continue to grow, then organically that snowball effect will occur, and you, aka we, in theory should be a household name. I'd like to think that in 5 years' time, realtor.co.nz will be a household name.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of that is about staying alive and continuing to build that, compound that goodwill. I think that people don't put enough emphasis on compounding goodwill and compounding relationships and networks, and creativity on the edges that don't seem or don't seem scalable. So it's definitely possible, and I think it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, and it's about staying in the game. And I think what you've done strategically, and maybe it's some of the StarCraft paying off, is that you're making sure that you're basically reaping enough minerals to keep going. And at different points in time, you might be more aggressive with the minerals relative to how much you're able to actually farm. But if you're efficient, then it's all good.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic. You've got to know when to expand, and you've got to know when to tactically retreat. Tactical retreats ultimately are not necessarily negative movements. It's often actually the path to a greater victory, albeit down the tracks or at a later point in time. With business, with startups, protecting the core is the most important, because if you don't, ultimately you lose. And you're no longer in business. If you protect the core and you expand at a reasonable rate, you take advantage when you can, in terms of opportunities, never of people or things like that. But yeah, it's all about that strategic thinking. Classically, you've ultimately got to be fighting battles everywhere, like all at once, and ensuring that if it's a positive interaction for yourself, you continue. If it's not, you withdraw, then you think about, okay, well, where's the next place that I could potentially position myself, and what do I need to do there to ensure that in a game, a 1 versus 1 game, to ensure that they are not paying attention to where you need them to not be paying attention to, then for your next move. So it's always about being that classic, 9 moves ahead. And a lot of that really does come down to impacts in business, because it's like, well, okay, well, what do I need to do now to ensure that ultimately, and that when this type of activity will come from a competitor in months or years, I've already fully covered that to the point in which, if they come to me with this scenario, I'm going to use it to my advantage, because we anticipated it was going to happen.
Sure.
And we've spun it around, and actually now they're on the back foot. And we've seen that. We've seen that with the types of movements potential competitors have done. But ultimately, if you start in the right space, you've got all of your bases loaded around your key foundational assets, legalities, and team members. You're quite well protected from that. And ultimately, given the nature of the experience and the strategy that you spent time on, whatever comes at you, you've got something to at worst, parry it. At best, use it as an opportunity to counter.
Yeah, totally. And awesome. Love the analogy towards StarCraft as well. First time we've got that in, I'm happy about it. How about this? Someone today that's starting to try and hustle and get some domains, perhaps solve some easy problems for people in the web space or the app space at large. What tools would you say are the best tools to help people do that on their own, even if, for example, like you said, you're not the best engineer or the best designer in the world, but you had to start somewhere and you got some experience. So what are some of those tools that are emerging now that are really driving the way?
Yeah, so my first point, and I will get to the tools, is it's really one of those things in which, when you're a child and you look and you think, the adults,
totally,
they've got everything sorted, they know exactly what they're doing, and like, I'm just a child. When you get to be an adult, you think, for the vast majority of people, a lot of people are winging it all the time. So as much as I really don't like the saying, fake it till you make it, you have to believe in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself, other people won't do that for you. And people have to remember that everyone has so much value. Everyone's past has set them up in a unique way, whatever that may look like, to actually succeed. Because the hard times, they may have forged you in a certain way. The good times, maybe they afforded you like an entrance to something or some people. Who knows? So I think it's really just believing in yourself, because if you don't, and you don't believe in yourself when you're doing those hard hours, if it's you there by yourself at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're questioning it, like, you really need to think, well, we'll give this a go. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with failure. Like, you have to fail fast. There's things I look back and
the dream that you'd anticipated,
they haven't worked out as I expected and I hoped, you know what I mean? But what I didn't let them bother me. You take the learnings, you dust yourself off and you get up, you get back up there, because ultimately one of the key issues is if people stay static. As long as you're pivoting, you're always moving forward. Sometimes you might have to go a different direction to where you're expected, but believe in yourself, believe in your family, go out to your connections, and look, reach out to people that actually, maybe they're a type of person that you want to be. They'll either get back to you or they won't. Worst case is they don't. You didn't really lose anything other than a couple of minutes. If they do, maybe that'll be important to you. The other thing is, try and find mentors. I can think back, and there's probably 4 people over the last 20 years that I really believe have helped me. And the key thing that I will say is because I believed, and I actually truly understood that they believed in me as a person. So It's really about setting yourself up and setting your mentality to think, well, look, I deserve success. I believe in myself. And I think what I'm going to do is going to change you know, either a small group of people, a medium group, maybe even the world. And I'm going to give that a shot. The second thing is we're living in absolutely the
Totally.
golden age of assistance.
It's
This
the
is
Renaissance.
probably,
Yeah, it's a Renaissance period.
I think it's the fourth industrial, the, the fourth industrial revolution in terms of anybody with access to the internet is so much more prepared than probably at any other point in history to level that playing field. Naturally, it's the classic arms race, because if everyone has the same, then you're against everyone with the same, and obviously there's a base level. However, if you have an idea but you're lacking the skill set in, say, development or research or prototyping, that you can easily use some of the Gen AI tools to get ideas or create content, you're now potentially decades ahead of where you would have had to have been historically to attain that skill set. So, the classic being Chat GPT, great for researching. You've got Midjourney for imagery. You've got a lot of other ones that are specifically relating to generating written content, which are certainly stronger than Chat GPT. So, you'll see a lot of content these days, which is really quite well written. There's a few telltale signs. Always avoid M dashes, of course. But yeah, utilize the tools that are out there. There are some good ones that are, they're actually worth paying for. And if you're able to, say, maybe get a month of something and think, well, actually, before you get it, think, well, what would be the end goal of this? Maybe I could spin up a prototype. Why? Because then I can show potential partners within a business. If you use something like V0 for first selling, you could have like a really quick front end designed. It's so much a working product to be able to say, well, actually, this is my idea, rather than I've got an idea for this thing that does that, and people are kind of stuck. But if you're able to show them, they're able to look and feel and actually think, well, yeah, actually, I understand 90% of this concept within 10 minutes. That's so powerful.
And you learn a lot from clicking, more than you do from designs. You really do. There's just this innate feeling you learn and dynamic around properly being in a product that's been built. You learn so much. I was speaking to a really prominent tech founder today in our space, and he was talking about, I was asking, because they made a radical change during a development process, and they basically piled resource in to basically get the project done, and gave a lot of support, because basically the team was a little bit in over its head and a bit stretched. And I asked, at what point, did that occur? It wasn't at the start when you were planning. It was obviously halfway through. And he said this great comment, which was, it was at the end of the first 90%, not at the end of the second 90%. Which is to say that once you've got something 90% there, you're only halfway there. It's like when you become a black belt in jiu-jitsu, they say that the journey almost starts again when you receive your black belt.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that, it's classic Pareto, 80-20, you can definitely get to a point and then, you're at 90%, but you can essentially go on forever fine-tuning to get to that 100%. Nothing will ever be 100%, just because of the nature of, even if you look at, historically, I think it's La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, from Gaudi. It took, several hundred years to be completed, and it's just being completed at the moment. As soon as they complete that, they'll have to go and start fixing up something on a different part of it, because that's eroded and it's no longer complete. So as soon as they finish this thing here, they don't get it 100%. It'll be a 98, and then you have to go and rinse and repeat. And that's the nature of things. And I think that the pursuit of perfection is something that I ultimately try and avoid, because it's just so unrealistic. As long as you can hit that, if you can hit that, I think the golden number for me is 95. Whenever I do a project at my day job, and obviously for myself, I say that, okay, we're not doing like a number 8 wire type thing. We're going to hit 95. And the reason for that number is, yes, we know we've left a few things to get done, and we can eventually get back to them. But I feel that's the critical point in which you've got it so that it's absolutely the best it can be, knowing the 5% is unattainable to a certain degree.
And remove stuff, right? Remove stuff.
Yeah, and then you need to go back and basically say, well, of the original design, what's not being utilized at all, or utilized to the least amount, or what's costing us disproportionately more than we expected. Is there a way to adjust that? It's iterations on iterations on iterations.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, 100%. Well, this has been awesome, James. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. It's been a good one, and I'm glad we got some gaming references in there. And I think the first time we've talked about South Korea on the pod, but not the first time we've talked about travel. So that's clearly a great stepping stone to kind of discovering yourself and going to the next level. So thank you so much. And thank you.
Oh, cheers. It has been a fantastic opportunity to speak. And, I do think that the time that we've spent over the last week or so getting to know each other has been really valuable. Going back to what I said earlier in the podcast, we're in maybe not necessarily similar spaces per se, but I think there's a lot of commonality with the types of work that we can do. So if I think back to if I was just starting out and I said, and I reached out to you on LinkedIn or something and said, hey, Charlie, really cool what you're doing. Hey, you know what? What would be the main thing that you would say to me that you would do if you're in the startup? And, that would be something that somebody could do. And if there's ever anybody that's, maybe thinks that the things that I've potentially have done or will be doing, feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn, because at the end of the day, I'll either be able to answer the question or I won't. But if I can't, I literally say I don't know. And there's nothing wrong with that. But yes, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, totally. It's always good to expand the network, right? The power of the network. So absolutely, totally concur with that. And it's great that you're offering that up as and being open, because I know that there's usually a divergence between openness around that and then perhaps sometimes being like, no, I don't really feel like it. And that's fine at different times in your life too. But that's awesome. I hope people take you up on your offer, because they'd benefit greatly. You've got lots of wisdom to share. Let's get you back on the pod when Realtor's gone to the next level and you've got some more updates for us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Charlie.
Cheers.